Good morning and welcome to this webinar on being an anti-racist in the workplace. I'd like to firstly begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you on the unceded lands of the Yagara and the Turrbal people and pay my respects to elders past, present and emerging, and to extend those respects to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people that are on this webinar today. This always was and always will be Aboriginal land. My name is Giridharan Sivaraman. I'm the Commonwealth Race Discrimination Commissioner. And before I start, I also want to thank my advisor, Naz Jacobs, who helped prepare this presentation for me. Just note, this webinar is being recorded and will be made available on the webinar page of the Multicultural Queensland Month website in the next week or so. So I'm here to talk about how to be an anti-racist in the workplace. We all spend high proportions of our lives every day at the workplace. It's the first thing you ask someone when you meet them. What do you do for work? It's also an environment where many people can be subject to racism, but also an environment that holds great opportunity for change. I want to start with a story, something to give you context. Fatima Abdullah, a pseudonym, is the CEO of a successful communications company in Syria. Due to her work, she speaks some English, but her native tongue is Arabic, and she can read and write in English. Her qualifications are all from Syrian institutions. She's a devout Muslim and observes Ramadan, as well as wearing a hijab. She and her family migrate to Brisbane in Australia. With hope, excitement and fear, like all of us who are migrants, she arrives. An important part of her new life is employment, of course, but from the outset, this proves to be challenging. Wherever she looks, it's difficult to find jobs that accept overseas qualifications. She's not connected into professional networks, and often when she looks at advertisements, they want Australian experience, which she doesn't have. Jobs in the public service are particularly daunting because the number of criteria are so unclear. She ends up going for a job far below her level of experience. The interview process proves to be stressful. She feels more confident in written English, yet it's a conversational style interview with Australian colloquialisms she doesn't understand. She manages to get a job. When she starts in the job, she's introduced as being from Syria. No one seems interested in the fact that she was a successful CEO. People are nice. There seem to be a lot of comments on the food she packs for lunch. Praying is difficult as there's no safe, easy place to pray in the workplace. She often ends up in the bathroom. At one point, in trying to explain a bit about her culture, she writes her name in Arabic on a whiteboard. She leaves it up for a while, but then HR come to her and say that people have said they're a bit uncomfortable seeing Arabic in the workplace. So it's rubbed off. Ramadan coincides with a busy period at work, and she's told that all employees need to work longer hours for that month, without exception, meaning she's consistently delayed in breaking her fast, which contributes to her fatigue. Disenchanted, she tries to make connections, but finds most networking occurs at Friday night drinks with alcohol, where she doesn't feel comfortable. She does apply for promotions, but is told she doesn't have the right cultural fit for leadership. Finally, feeling like she isn't seen, valued or respected, she leaves. In her exit interview, no one asks her whether she's experienced racism of any kind. Everything I've just described to you is based on real experiences of many people of racialised backgrounds. And I want you to remember this story as I talk to you about how to be an anti-racist in the workplace. At the Australian Human Rights Commission, my excellent team, the Race Discrimination team, led by Dr. Rosalie Artier, is currently developing the National Anti-Racism Framework, due to be released in November. And in consultations for that framework, participants describe how racism affects the capacity of some to obtain work, how the racism they face in the workplace impacts their career progression, retention and well-being. And they say that these experiences are exacerbated when racism intersects with other forms of discrimination, including gender, age, religion, visa status, English language proficiency and accent. And racism creates poor work conditions. Discrimination and hostility in the workplace impact on job satisfaction, well-being and job security. The Australian Human Rights Waiyani Untangani report found that Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander women experience significant bullying in the workplace. The Diversity Council Australia recently found that employees who feel excluded at work are 5 times less likely to be satisfied with their jobs, 3 times more likely to feel work negatively impacts their mental health, and 3.5 times more likely to leave their employer. So you can see the profound impact that racism has. But before we discuss the actions we can take to make workplaces safer and more equitable for us all, I want to explain to you what structural racism is. And that really is necessary to then actually explain what an anti-racism approach is, by comparison to, say, a diversity and inclusion or D&I approach. When most people think of racism, they immediately think of the interpersonal, such as overt racist remarks or hateful conduct. This, of course, is racism, but it is a limited understanding of how racism functions in our society and in our workplaces. Here's the thing. Racism is rarely about race. It's usually about power and privilege. Structural racism ensures that power and privilege is maintained by the dominant race. In Australia, that dominancy is white. It's the white Anglo race culture and identity which remains dominant and structurally so. Remember, many of our institutions, including workplaces and public service, were built during colonial times, baked in during the White Australia policy, and now they're meant to let in people like me and others, but structurally do they do that? And let me explain how this structural racism operates in an employment context. And here I'm very grateful to the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Guideline to Race Discrimination in the Workplace. I should just note at this point that that guideline and some other resources will be sent to everyone with the recording. And at the end of my presentation, you'll get a chance to ask questions. So, how does structural racism operate in the workplace? Well, it starts from the sourcing of candidates. Where are roles advertised or recruitment campaigns targeted? Do they end up targeting institutions or professional networks with low representations of First Nations people or other negatively racialised individuals? Are overseas qualifications recognised? How is the criteria worded? Too often in the public service, I see so much jargon and waffle that it probably excludes people from migrant backgrounds. In Fatima's case, all of this impacted her ability to look for work. Then there's the recruitment process. Racial bias can affect decisions that are supposedly on merit. It's well documented that applicants with Anglo-sounding names are far more likely to receive job interviews than those with non-Anglo names, even if their qualifications are similar. So are the applications de-identified? Is there anyone with lived experience of racism on the interview panel? Conversational style interviews can create barriers for racialised applicants who do not speak English as a first language. Has that been considered in deciding how to run the interview? Again, all of this, as we see, impacted Fatima. Someone gets the job, then there's the onboarding process. Is that done in a culturally safe manner? How often have we, of racialised backgrounds, been introduced in a workplace by our race rather than our professional background or role? The next point, of course, is remuneration. Do overseas qualifications mean people of racialised backgrounds get lower salaries than their white counterparts? Now you're in the workplace, your remuneration's been set, but are you culturally safe if you're from a racialised background or a First Nations background? Can languages other than English be spoken in the workplace? I know of many workplaces where people have been penalised for speaking languages other than English. Is there a safe place to pray? Can a racialised employee or a First Nations employee have leave or other considerations for cultural needs? That's an issue that's consistently raised as a barrier for First Nations employees. The reality is the only religious holidays enshrined in law in this country are Christian ones. Do restrictive dress codes forbid certain cultural clothing or hairstyles? If allegations of racism are raised in the workplace, do they get addressed? And in a safe way that protects the person raising them. The next issue is development and promotion. Are racialised employees unable to access development opportunities because their boss doesn't see them as the white normative idea of a leader? Are they meaningfully included in decision-making processes? Who carries the cultural load for change? So often, it falls on the racialised employee to bring about the change rather than those who are in power. And we see for Fatima how difficult and unfair that can be. Do employers actively interrogate why there are so few people of colour in positions of leadership? And this is particularly pronounced in the public service. And finally, on separation of employment, do we ask employees of negatively racialised backgrounds whether they experienced racism? And do you ask it in such a way that takes into account structural racism? None of what I just described in terms of each step of the workplace was direct interpersonal racism. All of what I just described was structural racism. And you can see how on each occasion that structural racism impacted someone like Fatima. And in that case, the employer could have had someone with incredible global experience that is likely no one else in the workplace had. Instead, she leaves the workplace with her identity and self-worth diminished, and the employer goes back to recruitment, potentially making all the same mistakes again. Remember, structures and processes might appear neutral or fair when in fact they're not. Many structures and processes disadvantage people of racialised backgrounds, hence they are racist. If you want an anti-racist workplace, if you are genuinely committed to that, you need to change those structures. That's why it's essential to understand structural racism if we're going to implement anti-racist approaches in workplace. If we only understand racism in its interpersonal forms, it's really easy to say that we aren't part of the problem because we're not doing or saying racist things to other people. However, when we understand structural racism, we know that we have a responsibility as individuals and organisations to actively dismantle the implicit racism in the structures and institutions we're part of. And you don't just change those structures by having diversity and inclusion programs. And I'm sorry to dismantle D&I programs, but I have to. There's a few reasons for this. Firstly, not everyone who is diverse or culturally and linguistically diverse suffers racism. Secondly, if you simply decide to set diversity targets but don't have an anti-racist approach to the structures in your workplace, you'll maintain power with whiteness and Anglo culture. Those of racialised backgrounds who want to enter the workplace or progress will have to shed themselves of the culture, language, religion, dress, even ways of working. Shed themselves effectively of everything that makes them different but the colour of their skin, the one thing they cannot change. It is the racism of benign assimilation. So in effect, the D&I program might be presented as furthering equality when in fact it is doing the opposite. The structures you have will continue to exclude or suppress those of racialised backgrounds. A D&I target might have led to Fatima being hired, but unlikely would have led to her having the job she deserved, feeling culturally safe at work, progressing in her employment, or being retained. And of course, the employer is now significantly lost as well. We're in a society, and it is no different in workplaces, where the person who calls out racism often receives far more backlash than the racism itself. Hence, confronting racism can be uncomfortable and inconvenient almost for leadership, who are in general from a homogenous background and not a racialised background. Real leadership requires an honest recognition of how racism operates structurally and how racism, rather than merit, may have resulted in someone progressing to leadership. So the precursor, the first step in tackling racism in any institution, including workplaces, requires meaningfully acknowledging racism as an ongoing issue which shapes our society in many ways. And meaningful acknowledgement of racism in an Australian context must be grounded in recognition of First Nations self-determination, adopting an intersectional lens, and involving truth-telling about our history and the resulting systemic and structural racism. We must acknowledge it is a problem and then make the effort to build racial literacy by improving our understanding about race and racism in Australia. From there, we can connect people through common understanding and build momentum for anti-racism action. In the Human Rights Commission's consultations for the National Anti-Racism Framework, we found that anti-racism education in an Australian context should include emphasis on the unique experiences of First Nations people since colonisation, the link between Australia's colonial history and the present-day inequities experienced by First Nations people, Australia's migration history and discriminatory immigration laws and policies, the impact of Australia's migration history on current border control laws, policies and practices, as well as the current racialised narratives in the media and public discourse, especially in defining who gets to be Australian. Anti-racism education should also incorporate diverse histories, knowledge and culture, and have actively anti-racist practices and engage with intersectional experiences of racism. This approach to education should form the basis of effective workplace training initiatives to begin addressing racism. But it's imperative that any initiative involves cultural safety, and that's something I'll explain. In the Commission's consultations for the National Anti-Racism Framework, cultural safety was identified as a best practice approach for addressing racial inequities, barriers and harms experienced in the workplace. So, what is cultural safety for those that haven't heard that term before? In 1989, Maori nurses developed the concept of cultural safety in seeking to address inequities experienced by First Nations peoples by challenging the view that everyone should be cared for in the same way. Cultural safety requires service providers and organisations to develop meaningful and accountable relationships built on an understanding of communities' unique needs and strengths. It also requires an ongoing process to recognise how cultural, professional and institutional locations impact interactions and service provision. Cultural safety is a dynamic and flexible process. It's a framework and outcome that enables safe and accessible environments to be defined by employees. It's a strengths-based approach. It moves from the so often used deficit narrative that surrounds cultural difference and instead focuses on empowerment, healing and self-determination. It can take many forms. Anti-racism education and building racial literacy, as I mentioned before, is foundational to this. Our consultation participants cited such training as paramount to building a respectful and inclusive workplace. They shared that this training needs to be ongoing and either mandatory or tied to professional development, and crucially, must be for leaders. The Commission was advised that culturally safe workplaces also involve anti-racist recruitment and hiring practices, mentoring and retention practices, cultural accommodations that can support staff with lived experience of racism and draw on their strengths, and safe and transparent discrimination, harassment and vilification reporting mechanisms. All of that would have helped Fatima. The Commission also heard that there needs to be a long-term commitment from organisations to continuously monitor and evaluate their practices, programs and policies. And participants suggested that auditing could monitor the cultural safety of spaces. In our consultations for the National Anti-Racism Framework, cultural safety was offered as a solution to what was described as the ineffectiveness of workplace diversity and inclusion initiatives. Participants told the Commission that to date, these initiatives have generally not adequately centred the needs of diverse staff and their safety, nor have they taken a strengths-based approach to diversity and inclusion, the classic tick-the-box exercise. Participants indicated that to address structural barriers in workplaces and diversity and inclusion policies, practices must not only be included in an organisation's policy, but must be implemented to their full potential. Hence, walk the walk, don't just talk the talk. And while diversity and inclusion initiatives might get diverse staff in the door, it doesn't protect them from the racism they may face in the workplace, it doesn't draw on their strengths, and it often results in a lack of retention. That's exactly what Fatima's example showed. And the Commission's Waiyinani Utangani report observed that identified roles, where an employer identified that a position is to be filled by a First Nations employee, are often tokenistic in nature and fail to provide opportunities for them to participate meaningfully in organisations and share their worldview. First Nations women and girls told the Commission that they also experience stress when they enter these roles, reporting the need to work harder and deliver better outcomes than their non-Indigenous counterparts. So the Waiyinani Yutangani report asserts that a culturally safe and respectful environment can help make these workplaces more inclusive to First Nations people, rather than a tokenistic exercise that compounds their cultural load, where their unique contributions and skill sets are seen as valuable assets to the workplace and community at large. Culturally safe workplaces are environments where there isn't pressure to assimilate or code switch, and where people feel safe to be who they are and show up to their work as their full selves. Now, many of you will have heard the term code switching, and many of you will have done it. Some of you will have done it without even realising you've done it. And I'm talking here to people of racialised backgrounds. And those of you that are not, you will have been around people that have and just didn't realise it. And code switching is the way in which someone consciously or unconsciously adjusts their language, behaviour and or appearance to fit into the dominant culture. The Diversity Council of Australia released a report in 2023 that showed for women of colour how common it is in Australian workplaces. DCA surveyed almost 400 self-identified culturally and racially marginalised women, as they defined it, as women who are black, brown, Asian or any other non-white group who are forced to the periphery due to their race. The survey found that most of them code switched because they feared that if they did not, they would be overlooked by their managers for jobs and promotions. The participants reported that leadership models used for assessing talent in Australian organisations were inherently biased towards what the Diversity Council refers to as the more masculine Western or Anglo leadership styles, which value extroversion and self-promotion. This, the report says, has the effect of inadvertently excluding culturally diverse women from consideration for senior roles. I do wonder how inadvertent it is when it ensures a certain group maintains their power and privilege. The report found that 83% of participants, 83% reported experiencing pressure to act, look and sound like existing leaders who were most likely to be white men. And 69% reported having to act white to fit in, and 66% reported having to act white to get ahead. Remember, this is a 2023 report. It is happening now. It is not ancient history. So, what do we do to deal with these issues? Now, I've already said to you that the burden of supporting and upholding cultural safety and addressing racism in organisations is often placed on First Nations and negatively racialised people. This is often called cultural load or the colonial load. It means that people who are of racialised backgrounds or First Nations backgrounds are the ones that, in addition to enduring structural racism and suffering from racism, are then expected to take on the load or take on the job, be the champions of the change that is required. That is, of course, a difficult responsibility, an enormous responsibility, and one that is very difficult when you're already suffering from the racism of the structures you're within. And it's often compounded, as I said earlier, by the fact that people who call out racism are marginalised or silenced or not taken seriously and receive more backlash than the racism itself. So if the responsibility is placed on First Nations people or people of racialised backgrounds, it actually compounds the racism that is occurring and means that it's far less likely for there to be change. If you want to bring about the change, the responsibility has to be of the organisation and it has to be of the leadership of the organisation. As my friend Benny Bowl, the president of the Queensland African Communities Coalition, has often said, real change requires leadership, and it requires courageous, honest leadership that is prepared to confront this very systems that have allowed people to rise to those positions of leadership. So it is the responsibility of organisations. Organisations have to ensure that cultural safety is embedded within workplace programs, policies and practices as a workplace health and safety issue. Bear in mind, there are uniform across this country obligations to ensure that employees are safe, and the requirement to have a psychosocial safety policy and to ensure the psychosocial safety of employees is legally required here in Queensland. So there is, in some senses, already an obligation, a legal obligation, to ensure that you are anti-racist in the workplace and that you don't allow racism to affect the safety of employees in your workplace. What I'm talking about today, what I've been describing to you today, is ensuring their cultural safety as a means of dealing with the structural racism that impacts on employees. So I'm not actually asking or telling people to do something in some senses they don't already have to do, but I'm asking for it to be done in a meaningful way, in a way that actually brings about systemic change, in a way that will have the most impact. So what does that require? It requires organisations to ensure that cultural safety is embedded within workplace programs. They have to be embedded within policies and practices as a workplace health and safety issue, as I've just described, rather than seeing it as an issue as a nice to have or something that we'll do in the future, or this is what we're going to come around to this. It is actually an imperative to deal with now. And the important thing is a culturally safe approach can help to correctly situate the burden of addressing racism with institutions rather than just with individuals. And that is paramount to the success of an anti-racism approach within the workplace. The title of this webinar was How to be Anti-Racist in the Workplace. And of course I've talked about what we can do as individuals, and I'll talk about that a bit more. But the challenge I'm throwing down here is to organisations and the leadership of those organisations as to whether you're prepared to look at the structures that you use from when people are looking for work right up until when they try to get to positions of leadership and everything in between, and whether those structures systemically disadvantage people of racialised backgrounds. The burden has to be with the institution. If it remains with the individual, particularly with racialised individuals, it is very unlikely that you will get the change that is necessary. So, what are the steps that can be taken? The first step is meaningful acknowledgement of racism and its structural impacts. We at the Australian Human Rights Commission recently did a report mapping all levels of government and their anti-racism initiatives or work. And what we found was that in many areas of government, they don't even want to use the word racism, let alone have a policy or an initiative to confront it. And that includes within workplaces. When we looked at local councils and local government authorities, there are 537 local government authorities in Australia. And in the mapping report, we found 3 that actually have an anti-racism policy and initiative. Now, let's just say that was undercounting. Let's say it's 30. Let's say it's 50. There's still going to be 480 local government authorities that don't have an anti-racism policy. So that very first step is actually one that's often not met. That is meaningful acknowledgement of racism. Hence, don't just talk about diversity and inclusion or diversity and equity. Actually talk about racism, meaningfully acknowledge how it affects the organisations within which you operate and the structures within those organisations. The next step is self-reflection. There is, of course, still a role for all of us as individuals. We have to take accountability of the role we may play in perpetuating racism. When you walk into a meeting, when you have an interview, when you have an interaction with an employee, acknowledge your own biases. Understand how power operates in that dynamic, how what might seem very natural to you, very easy to you, may not be to someone else, not because they don't have merit, not because they're from another country, not because of their religion, not because of the way they dress, but because it's natural to you, because it's what the structure and the system prefer and allows to propagate. So we have to educate ourselves and build our own racial literacy. And for those of you that may have been wondering what racial literacy means, in a very basic sense, it's when I walk into a room, someone might have a presumption, a bias about me just from looking at me, just from my name. Understanding how that racism operates, or that bias or prejudice operates, is racial literacy. In an institutional sense, it is understanding, or trying to build your understanding, of how the systems, processes and practices in your workplace, which is the institution we're talking about today, how they may disadvantage people of some races. I throw back to the example of Fatima again. Every step of the way, no one was directly racist to her, but she was prejudiced because of her race every step of the way. Understanding how that operated on her and others of racialised backgrounds is the building of racial literacy. It is the understanding of how race operates at every step of the way. And so that is the crucial next step in terms of, first you talk about racism, you acknowledge that it is an issue, then you build racial literacy. Understand how racism operates in the institutions within which you are. Because it is so often that they are coated with the veneer of neutrality, when in fact, once that veneer is removed, they are not. Next, as individuals, we can use our leverage within workplaces to advance equity, remove structural barriers, and embed culturally safe and anti-racist practices. Now, I said that the responsibility is with organisations. Of course, I understand that. I support that more than understand that. I said that because that's clearly where it is. But we as individuals also have a responsibility, and we can try and promote the structures that will work. But when I said before that the leaders have a particular role to play, and that is clearly the case. Leaders have the leverage within workplaces to be allies, to carry the colonial load, and to take the cultural load off those employees of racialised backgrounds. They can then remove the structural barriers and embed cultural safety and anti-racist practices. The next step is training. We can all learn. We can educate others, and we can build our racial literacy. And there are great resources available to help do this. As I said earlier, after my presentation, we'll be sending well, not me, but I think the Multicultural Queensland will be sending an email which will have some resources. And in that, there will be a guide to debunking the myths and misconceptions about racism. This is a fantastic guide that's been produced by my team at the Australian Human Rights Commission. And I'd really encourage you to read that. That guide has actually been used by the Department of Home Affairs to run anti-racism training, and was sent by the Department of Home Affairs in a Multicultural Affairs employee for the APS, the Australian Public Service. So that just shows to you how strong the guide is and how much it has resonated. So I'd encourage you to read it and to use it as a means of building racial literacy and educating yourself and others. Another tool is conducting a cultural temperature check within your organisation. And it just so happens that the Australian Human Rights Commission has such a tool, which again will be distributed in the email that carries the video. It's important not to presume that you know how culturally safe your organisation might be. Those of us, or people that are not affected by a lack of cultural safety, who think that things are neutral, will not actually be able to see the lack of cultural safety. So what you need is an external tool to be able to measure that. And that is something the Australian Human Rights Commission has developed, and I would encourage you to use. Next, it is very important that organisations then continuously monitor and evaluate practices, programs and policies. It is not good enough to simply say we acknowledge racism is an issue and then perhaps do something, bring about some kind of change, some sort of practice, and then not monitor and evaluate whether it's actually been effective. That often, in our experience at the Commission, means that programs die away, they're not followed through, they become tick-the-box exercises, they don't actually bring about structural change, they don't embed anti-racist practices, programs and policies. And in effect, it becomes a hollow exercise where the organisation says we're doing something when actually they're doing nothing. The next step is embedding cultural safety, and that starts from anti-racist recruitment and hiring practices, as I explained with the example of Fatima, mentoring and retention practices, cultural accommodations that can support staff with lived experience of racism, and safe and transparent discrimination, harassment and vilification reporting mechanisms. It's very important that they're safe, and that is something we've often received in terms of feedback, that people that report racism feel very unsafe as soon as that is done. They feel like they're victimised, pushed to the periphery, denied opportunities, that their claims aren't taken seriously. So that is a paramount part of the process. And one other thing I want to note here, embedding cultural accommodation isn't somehow pandering to the deficit. That is, oh, well, we've got to do this because these people need more. It is actually a strengths-based approach because you can learn from others' cultures. You can learn from a broader knowledge base, a broader sense of identity. And it is clearly fairer, and it is actually a more accurate reflection of our workplaces and our society. I often point out the fact that there were 12 Africans on the First Fleet. And the First Fleet, of course, came only after 60,000 years of the oldest continuous culture on the planet. So the notion of cultural safety is not somehow removed from the actual notion of the actual identity of this country, the people within it, and the people therefore within the workplaces that you're all in. It is a genuine reflection of that identity. The next step is to take an intersectional approach. Experiences of racism in the workplace and otherwise are exacerbated when racial discrimination intersects with other forms of discrimination, including gender, age, visa status, and discrimination based on English language proficiency and accent. I recall very vividly and clearly Noura Ahmad, the Chief Executive of the Islamophobia Register, who is a woman of colour, Muslim, who wears a hijab, who talked about every day when she gets up, each and every one of those things impacts on her impacts on the way in which she's treated by other people, impacts on the way in which structures impact on her. And when they intersect, they compound dramatically. That is a great example of why an intersectional approach to understanding racism is so crucial. And again, Fatima's case was a good example of that, where each aspect of her identity and her culture and her religion and her language and her race, all of which are part of her race, affected the way she was treated in workplaces. All of these are concrete steps that I hope would be able to help you in terms of bringing about meaningful change in the workplace. It might seem like the challenge is hard, but actually great work is being done in many places, and there are really good examples out there that we have seen of people genuinely trying to bring about anti-racist practices within workplaces. The important thing to do is to note that you acknowledge that racism exists and that we can improve. The very fact that we have over 1,300, I heard this morning, people registered for this presentation indicates to me that there is a strong desire for us to move beyond diversity and inclusion and towards genuine anti-racism within the workplace. The thing is, it's not just anti-racism within the workplace, it is about how anti-racism can change the workplace, change the structures and processes of the workplace. But now is the time to show your courage, and particularly for leaders of organisations, but for everyone. Now is the time to show your courage in being prepared to take those next steps. And I'm sure you can do it, and I hope that this was a useful guide as to some of the concrete steps that you can take. I'd like to now open this up for questions and comments. You can click on Ask a Question by moving your mouse over the screen and clicking the three dots in the bottom right of the player below me. Please provide your name and email address just in case we don't get to your question today. And then hopefully I'll do my best in terms of answering whatever questions you put forward today. And there may be a slight lag between when you ask the question and when they come up, but I think I'll do my best. Now I can see some questions have come up. I'm just going to put my glasses on so I can read them properly. Okay. All right, so I'll just go from the top. From Jane. Do you have any examples of workplaces that do anti-racism well? What do they look like and how do they get there? Yes, we do. There is hope, Jane. So in the report that I referred to earlier, which was prepared by PricewaterhouseCoopers Indigenous and the Jumbunna Institute, the UTS Jumbunna Institute, mapping of government's anti-racism approaches, there were some councils that were shown to be really leading the way in terms of anti-racism work. Darebin City Council was one of those. And how did they get there? They got there by, in some senses, following those steps that I just read out to you. One, acknowledging that racism is an issue and racism needs to be acknowledged in terms of how it structurally affects the workplace and the work that is done. Two, by actually putting resources towards building knowledge and education about how racism operates and building racial literacy. Three, they actually created a specific anti-racism unit within the council and gave it genuine power to try and bring about change. And four, monitoring and evaluating how that anti-racism unit was progressing. So that's one example in terms of a workplace that does anti-racism well. There would be other examples, and I'm sure, and you can have a look at that report, and you can have a look at the other resources in the Australian Human Rights Commission website, particularly where it's under the Race Discrimination team. Next question from Laney. Is it possible to please get a link to the data mentioned a minute or so ago, re workplaces evaluating masculine Western Anglo qualities? Thank you very much. Yes, so what I was referring to there was the Diversity Council of Australia report on code switching and the way in which women of racialised backgrounds needed to switch to fit into those masculine Western Anglo type qualities. So great suggestion, thank you. We could add a link to that, I would think, in the email that gets sent out in about a week. I can't do it right now, I'm sorry, I don't actually know how in terms of the setup, but I think that my understanding is that everyone that's registered will get the email that gets sent next week, so you'll get a copy of that report. Next question. Question, racialised. Can the speaker explain use of the term racialised? I've not heard that before. That's a great question. Thank you for asking that. In using that term, I was trying to do with an issue, and that the issue is, how do we define people that have experienced racism? I'm trying to move away from terms that have been used in the past, such as, for example, or are still not used in the past, still used now, like culturally and linguistically diverse. Another term that does get used a bit is culturally and racially marginalised. But sometimes those terms aren't actually sufficient for describing how racism operates, and what they do is they base it on the identity of the person rather than how the institution operates on a person. So when I say racialised, what I'm saying is that you become the other, you become racialised by the way a structure operates to prevent you from being able to enter the workplace or progress within the workplace or feel culturally safe in the workplace. You are who you are, but the institution racialises you and makes it harder for you. So another way to have described it would simply be to say people that experience racism. That's why I'm using the term racialised. If you look at the Victorian Equal Opportunity and Human Rights Commission guideline to addressing racism in the workplace, you'll see that they have a discussion about terminology, and they also use the term racialised because they see that as a better way to describe the experiences of people who experience racism in the workplace. And certainly when the National Anti-Racism Framework is released later this year, we'll also be looking at how language is used. For me, I'm trying to use a term to try and actually build a sense of understanding, but I'm really glad that you asked that question, because I probably should have explained why I use that term to people that would be unfamiliar with it. Some more questions. Having listened to your talk, this is from Derek Fernando, having listened to your talk, your excellent talk, thanks Derek. It is a tall order to change both the people and structures. Current methods would hardly make a dent into the problem. How about initiating legal methods to deal with authorities that are engaged in discriminatory racial practices? Punishment often works better than well-meaning policies. The thing is, Derek, I was a lawyer for 20 years before I became Race Discrimination Commissioner, and of course legal options and remedies have an important role to play, but I think that as they stand, are not sufficient. I talked to you about how we have a psychosocial code of practice, which means you should have workplaces that are culturally safe, but people don't look at those codes as needing to do that work because they simply don't see or understand how racialised people have a lack of cultural safety in the workplace. There isn't yet a positive obligation to eliminate racism here in Queensland. There might be, and depending on what happens with legislation that's currently before, in Parliament as such. So we could see changes that bring about legal methods to to bring about change. But I'm really hoping that on this anti-racism journey, we don't make it that people think, well, I've got to do this because the law needs me to treat people equally or with equity, or to recognise that institutions operate in such a way to disadvantage others. I don't want it to be that people do it just because I feel like they have to. I'm hoping that they understand that this is actually to everyone's benefit, and it is a reflection of the true nature of the identity of people in the workplaces. We'll all benefit, all workers, employees and employers, if everyone feels culturally safe, if everyone can be their whole selves, if everyone's experience is recognised. Imagine what you can draw upon in the workplace by doing that, rather than being confined to one particular way. So I'm really hoping that you see this not as just an obligation, but as an opportunity to draw upon the strengths of the people that are entering your workplaces, and therefore make your workplace, your organisation stronger. Shelley Fido, not a question but a thank you. Thank you, Shelley. I just want to thank you for your candid and honest session today. I always attend and urge my colleagues to attend the Multicultural Affairs Queensland webinars, as I walk away with confronting yet necessary truths. It is also facilitated by people who are passionate and have lived experience of the burden of living as a CALD member of our society, culturally and linguistically diverse member of our society. We can never stop learning on this topic and never stop actively trying to bridge the alarming gap from where we are to where we need to be. We need meaningful systemic changes and not just the tick-the-box strategies. Giridharan, thank you for your endless work in this space. Well, thank you, Shelley. That's a very, very, very generous comment from you. I really appreciate it. And yes, we do absolutely have to not just do tick-the-box strategies. And that's what I talked about earlier. I know you weren't posing as a question, but just to take up on your point, that's the important thing. Trying to actually bring about structural change means you don't just say, okay, we've got a diversity and inclusion program, tick. We've increased our diversity. I mean, you actually have to look at how did the process operate? Are people going to positions that that genuinely reflect their qualifications? Do they feel safe? Do they progress? All of those things that I discussed in the talk. Last one. I think this is just someone saying 518. Shannon, there's 500. Oh, this is, sorry, Shannon from JPL Media. Sorry, Shannon. 518 registered, 505 watching live. Well, that's a good turnout. I'll just refresh and see if there's any more that have come up. Yep, there are a fair few more. Oh, wow. Sorry, there's heaps more. I'll see what I can get through. Okay. So Jasmine Young, individual impact versus organisation. We've addressed organisational responsibilities and actions that they can take to become an anti-racist organisation versus a less strengthening approach of diversity and inclusion. What is your best advice for an ally, not someone directly impacted by racism, to do on an individual level to contribute to anti-racism in the workplace? Thanks, Jasmine. I assume you're an ally. Thank you very much. We need allies. And I think as allies, it's actually being able to carry that colonial load, as I said before, or that cultural load, and say, I want to see anti-racism change. Push the organisation. Use the leverage you have so that it's not just the racialised people that have to do it. And then give validity to what they're saying. That's how you build power and you bring about change within an organisation. So you absolutely can do a lot as an ally. And I'm so happy to see that question, to see someone that says, yes, I want to contribute. Noel, Zimbabwe. G'day, Noel. How are you going? From the African Australian Advocacy Centre. All the way from Sydney, I think Noel would be watching this. How can organisations, departments effectively measure progress in creating a truly inclusive and anti-racist work environment? Yeah, that's a great question, Noel. And I talked about accountability. And I think it's that regular measurement of whether and what changes you're bringing, and whether or not you find a way to measure whether the cultural safety is actually working within the workplace. So you're going to have to talk to your staff. You're going to have to do it in a way that they feel safe to talk about their experiences. One of those examples was that cultural temperature check that I talked about. I think what's really important is an honest, regular transparent measurement of the changes that you're doing. Faye, influence leaders unaffected by racism. How do we influence leaders unaffected by racism to see overt structural racism in the workplace? Great question. For me, I think I've never heard of a leader that says, I want a racist workplace. I've seen plenty of organisational leaders that say, no, we don't condone racism of any kind, and we want our workplaces to be racism free. I think you seize upon that and say, well, what does that actually mean? Why do you think it's not racist? And then you have to probe and confront them in terms of the biases, assumptions that actually feed into their statements. That is very hard. I accept that is a challenging thing to do, particularly if they've got the power and you don't. But there are ways of building power, whether it be through unions or otherwise, so that you can try and have those difficult conversations. But that's why I started with the story of Fatima, because you can tell that story and you can say there was never racism, direct racism, but here's how a person was disenfranchised, disadvantaged because of their race throughout the process. Amy, employment targets. Can they be an effective tool to increase representation and keep leadership accountable? It's a really good question. And here's the thing. I've said to you, diversity and inclusion, if it just becomes a mere target without all of the other things that we need to do, naming racism, confronting lack of cultural safety, looking at how our structures operate, I don't think that the target in of itself will be an effective tool. The Australian Public Service announced that they want to increase the number of people of culturally and linguistically diverse backgrounds in positions within the organisation, including positions of leadership. That is absolutely a start, and I commend them for doing that. But it is only a start. It is not going to be successful if, to get through those processes, you have to shed yourself of everything that makes you different and you don't feel safe, culturally safe, within the workplace. So it's a tool to perhaps start the conversation, but it is not the tool to ensure that you've successfully been anti-racist in the workplace. And so in that sense, it's not the only tool to hold leaders accountable. Barbara, do you have thoughts about the work for white allies in the workplace and building a strong cohort of allies? I kind of answered that earlier in terms of someone else asked, what can an ally do? So again, thank you so much for the question. It's wonderful that that you want to be an ally, and I think what I described earlier in terms of carrying the cultural and colonial load, giving validity to the experiences, being prepared to call out how structural racism works, and do that under the, I suppose, the guide or the auspices of anti-racism. Vicky, lip service versus real change. Can you recommend top 5 tips to get started? E.g., put up posters, get diverse speakers in to staff meetings, ensure websites show diverse photos, include a statement in Eagle's email signatures such as acknowledge traditional owners. Yeah, I mean, I kind of gave you 5, well, it wasn't 5 tips, but 5 steps. I think it was 5 or 6 steps in terms of significant change. But you can have little things, for example, other languages within the workplace. I've heard stories of how difficult it was for an employee in their email signature, a public service employee, to have the Chinese spelling of their name and the hoops they had to jump through to get there. Such a small thing, but so significant in terms of accepting that other languages may operate in the workplace. But I think what you want in terms of small things is just talking and naming racism. I've said this before, you have to name the beast as slayed. So I reckon that's a small but very powerful thing that you can do. You mentioned, May, communication roles. You mentioned not racially discriminating against those from non-English speaking backgrounds. Do you have any suggestions on how to be an anti-racist when a role requires a high degree of written and verbal communication? Yeah, I think it's a good question. And so I think you have to understand firstly, well, how does the communications role actually operate? How much of it is verbal, or is a lot of it written? Is it being provided for someone else? Does it actually matter if the person, and sometimes it's not even what they say, but how they say it. For example, people with accents are often the subject of racism. It doesn't matter if someone has an accent. It shouldn't matter at all. And I think, should they just be given opportunities to provide written communication? There's a number of ways in which you can dissect that. Sorry, I just got my timer go off. I'll stop that. I'll keep going unless I'm told to stop, because there's a few other questions, and I'll try and get through a couple more. But if I get the hurry up, I'll stop. At a grassroots level and day-to-day conversations, how can we have educational conversations about racism? Unfortunately, most of the ones that care about this matter belong to the minority groups who experience this all the time. This is from Sylvia Castillo. Yeah, that's a really good question. As I said, the load often falls on those that are racialised, and I guess it's about whether the workplace provides a safe way in which those conversations can occur. So maybe instead of just having to have the conversations, you talk to the workplace about providing a space for those conversations to actually occur safely. Then you can start having the educational conversation, and you make sure that people that are white, that are not the victims of racism, are in those conversations. Amanda, can you please elaborate how cultural safety and inclusion differ? Yes. So inclusion is just, in a sense, it can be just a target, or it can be you're included as long as you assimilate to the way we operate. Cultural safety is saying, no, we understand that you have different strengths, cultural attributes of a different race. We're going to change the structure so that you feel safe. Noha, resistance to DEI anti-racism. How do you address resistance to calling out racism in the workplace? Well, the important thing is, for particularly at positions of leadership, but also in policies, programs and systems, that you actually use the word racism. If the word is used rather than something else, it's a lot easier to call it out. When people don't talk about racism, it's very difficult then to actually call out racism. Advice for First Nations people of colour staff. Giridharan, thank you so much for your webinar. As a person of colour working at a workplace where whiteness holds power, everything you spoke about strongly resonates with the experience of myself and other First Nations people of colour staff. Can I please ask, what advice would you have for First Nations people of colour staff who are working in a workplace where they're faced with structural racism? That's a huge question. So I guess I think it's those steps that I outlined. First, you have to try and get the workplace to actually acknowledge, use the word racism, then build racial literacy, then make sure those that are not the victims of racism carry that cultural load, then look at systems and processes, and then make sure that there's actual transparency on changes, and then measurements of accountability measurements as to whether changes are being implemented. I've probably gone over, so I'm probably going to have to make the next one my last question. How do you dismantle the dominant discourse of we all have problems and experience barriers? Why is this more relevant? So, of course, there are barriers to participation in employment for many different people, whether it be gender, disability, class, age. And so I think though, but that doesn't mean that we don't deal with racism. And racism often intersects with all of those other those qualities or attributes. So for me, I think it's saying we have to acknowledge that racism is a problem. We have to name it. We can't say, oh, well, there are other issues, so we're not going to deal with it. That doesn't deal with the problem, that doesn't deal with the structures, that doesn't actually reflect the history of this country and the way in which structures and institutions were built up. So let's start with an honest conversation. I think I've probably gone over time, so I probably will have to stop it there. Thank you so much for everyone that attended and watched. I really hope you got something out of that. Thank you so much to everyone that put in questions. They were fantastic questions. I'm sorry if I didn't get to your questions. I probably spent a bit too long on the first one, so I didn't realise how many were there. But I hope that that you got something out of that, and I encourage you to use those resources that will get sent to you in about a week or so. So thank you very much.